So what can a lobby watch organization contribute actually to a discussion on corporate power and corporate influence? I think quite a lot, because we are confronted with it in our everyday life as watchdog organizations. First of all, and I want to make 5 points. First of all, we see the imbalance of power every day. Every single day when we look at lobbying, we see there's difference in resources, right? In imbalance of power that it's massive. The German car industry, the German chemical industry, big tech, all of them have plenty of resources in comparison to those resources that civil society, for instance, has at hand. And there are differences, of course, between these concentrated sectors. The car industry, for instance, has for decades established privileged access to the German government, for instance, long-term relationships, which of course play also a role in lobbying and influence. So, lobby transparency that we've been demanding for years has disclosed this imbalance of power. With a lobby register in place, we've been fighting for that for 10 to 15 years. With the disclosure of lobby meetings on the EU level, for instance, at the top levels of the commissions, we see this imbalance of power. It's reflected in the lobbying. And so we have evidence, we have a source, and that's important. And so here we contribute with our work to a clearer picture of the imbalance of power that is there between corporations and the public interest. Our view has also become more differentiated. We don't distinguish anymore only between corporations and civil society. We also look at, with more differentiation at the conflicts between companies. And we have quite a number of SMEs amongst us today who share many of our interests with respect to corporate power concentrations, and welcome to those as well here in the room. So some of our fights go really together. We experience this in the Digital Markets Act. So my second point. Lobby regulation has really improved the situation with respect to corporate power. We have restrictions to corporate influence with the lobby regulations that are now in place in Germany, in some other member states, in the EU. So we have stricter cooling off periods. We have sometimes limits to party donations. We have rules for conflicts of interest for members of parliament. These are steps forward. They reduce influence of corporate lobbyists. And it also, these lobby regulations intervene into the establishment of some kind of closed shop, some kind of elite culture, where public officials and corporate lobbyists think they're in the same boat, although they are not at all. My third point, and I want to say before, I don't say we fix the imbalance of power problem with lobby regulation, but we contribute to it. My third point is, now how does economic power concentration itself enhance corporate influence on policy making? First, the obvious thing, resources. The more resources you have, the more you can lobby the policy process. This includes things such as public relations and deep lobbying via think tanks and sponsored research that you may all know if you are based in Brussels, for instance, or also in Berlin. Corporations can also leverage economic power as a political tool, especially by threatening to cut jobs with relocations or divestitures to press politicians to adopt the corporate demands. Third point, corporations can use their clout over other participants in the market, and some of the SMEs may know this, to influence their lobbying or to refrain them from opposing their views. Fourth, powerful corporations can determine what's in the market. This quasi-regulatory power, you could even argue, gives them a better understanding and allows them to circumvent a lot of regulation or even diminish the effects of the regulations. One example, the German car industry, that was announced. There was this agreement among German car makers to limit the size of AdBlue tanks for diesel cars in the Dieselgate scandal. So that is a clear example where there were agreements in a concentrated sector, and they really determined the way the products came into the market. Fifth, the power of corporations also has structural effects. Certain policy options don't come on the table anymore because politicians think they are unrealistic in the light of concentrated power. If we go against German industry interests, we are politically dead. This is a sentence I got yesterday in a lobby meeting again, and I was really like, wow, okay, this is a certain proof of what I was saying beforehand. Before I finish, 2 more points on corporate lobbying strategies I find super important to keep in mind as public interest groups. Corporate influence starts at the very beginning of legislation. Oftentimes, the frame in which policymakers negotiate about a new piece of legislation is extremely important. The framing happens at this very early stage of legislation and usually by means of a narrative. It narrows the debate among decision makers. To determine this frame is one of the key aims of corporate lobbying. It is reflected in the tools they use, the important role of think tanks, the important role of law and economic firms that back up their clients, like Google, with research on which points to legal limits, on which points we have legal limits, and in this early phase of legislations. Once this frame is set, it's hard to challenge it. The narrative sets the facts. My second point, and then I'm going to finish. Enforcement of legislation is as key as the rules themselves. That's an experience we've had with the Digital Markets Act that we followed very closely in the last 1.5 years. Corporations have understood very clearly that enforcement of legislation is as important, maybe even more important than the rules themselves. Good rules are worth nothing if they are not properly enforced. They become a paper tiger. A recent, as I said, good example is these rules to limit the power of big tech with the Digital Markets Act. Whereas the rules are relatively strong, the DMA rules, they might end up not being enforced due to a lack of resources. And the debate is ongoing, and it's rather with less public scrutiny once the rules have been finalized, the text has been finalized. The same, by the way, with the GDPR, the strong data protection rules, which are not properly enforced. To sum up, a market system, and I can only repeat what other speakers already have said in the room, a market system that allows extreme corporate concentration to happen and to increase strengthens corporate influence on policymaking. We know from recent research from the US that there is a deep interconnection between corporate concentration and lobby expenses. More concentration, more lobbying. If we want to break with that mechanism, which is toxic both for democracy, society in general, we have to further improve the ethics of politics, lobby regulations on the one hand, but we have to tackle corporate concentration on the other hand. Both are two sides of the same coin. Lobby control and monopoly control need one another. It's time to break monopoly power, to tackle it from both sides. It's time to rebalance power in our economy and society. Thanks. Good
afternoon, everyone. I have a PowerPoint presentation to go. That's the Academics always have PowerPoints now, and you have to have something to show. So I'm Filippo Lancieri. I'm a postdoc here at ETH, and I'm also a fellow at the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, which is a center that's dedicated to researching, I think, the interaction between companies and government, so really the topic of this conference. And so Max, when he invited me, it was a very kind invitation, also Nelly and everyone, thank you for putting together such an amazing event. He asked me to kind of summarize a little bit what is our theoretical academic understanding of corporate political power. So that's what I'll try to do in the next 10 minutes. And you see there's an interrogation mark over there. And that's because I do think, and that's one of the reasons why I also wanted to come here, that's an area that's incredibly under-researched and under-theorized. And it's very important for us to actually engage with everyone, listen to you. To learn better, we have to develop better tools, better theory to understand how this is taking place. So please talk to me afterwards. I'm really looking forward to hearing your experiences as well. So basically, what I'm going to talk about here is what are the theoretical sources of corporate political power. And what I'm talking about comes a lot from, the Stigler Center put a report a couple of years ago on what to do about the regulation of large tech companies. And so basically, we're looking at data protection, we're looking at antitrust and corporate power. And very early on, I think it dawned on us that we're going to have to propose some form of regulation. And then mostly pro-competitive regulation. And then we realized, okay, but these are some of the most powerful political companies in the world. So what we did is that we put what nerds do now. We gather political scientists, economists, and lawyers, and we set up a committee to study how would we think about the politics of tech companies, and how would they be able to yield the lobby power to influence the legislation. And this is what came out, so I'm going to say what's coming out of there, so if you want to check, it could be interesting. So basically what we argue is that if you look at the political economy scholarship, you can identify 5 structural sources of corporate political power. The first one, which is the most direct, straightforward, is structural and financial power. And this is the notion that the larger the firm is, usually the more resources and capacity it has for lobbying. Now, I think Max was alluding this now, that you need to have some resources to set up lobbying capacity, to have long-term interactions, long-term talks. And this, if you were an economist here, you could understand this as some kind of like fixed cost in lobbying capacity that allows you to have economies of scale and scope. And this can be extremely powerful, no? Like, I think this is the traditional way that you think about lobbying. But for another article that Christian was very nice to pinpoint, what we did is that we tried to look at what happened to antitrust when it was strong or when it was weak. So in my presentation, I won't really tackle mechanisms. I'm tackling sources. But this is basically, you look at, this is the before and after every single FTC and commissioner and DOJ antitrust attorney general. And basically, we can break antitrust enforcement in the US around 1975 or 1980, when it was stronger, when it was weak. And what you see is that when antitrust was strong, most people in both periods mostly come from government and from academia. This is the source of almost 2/3 of the commissioners. But while antitrust was strong, after they leave the FTC and the DOJ, they mostly go back to academia or they retire here. That's mostly what they do. And there's some people go to small law firms, but that's normal. When antitrust enforcement becomes weak, what you see is that 2/3 of the commissioners, immediately after they leave the FTC, their next job is to go work for the Defendants Bar Association. And that's not a very good thing if you want to do. And then I think this shows the power of long-term lobbying and resources, because you need to have a long-term commitment to create these mechanisms in place. But this is one of the things. The second structural source of political advantage is what we call media or agenda setting power. And this basically is that some companies, they develop a sort of media function, which is a capacity to shape the public discourse and to shape the informational environment around a certain topic. And what is more important here is that some of these firms then actually become the venues through which politicians understand they have to reach their constituents. And when they understand there's a situation of dependency and how they're going to look at these relationships, it becomes what I think Francis Fukuyama termed well, it becomes like a loaded gun. So basically, you don't have to exercise this power for people to adapt behavior. And another source that there is in the US that comes attached with it, but I think is also true for Europe, I just know less about Europe, is that in some places, when you have a media function, you have First Amendment or freedom of the press protections that limit regulation. And these you see very clearly, for example, when you look at tech companies in the US, that there was a law passed in Florida to shape what kind of discourse could be on social media or other type of content. We can debate the merits of the law. That's not the point. The point is that the law was blocked anyway because it said like, oh, you're actually breaching First Amendment protection, so you cannot really regulate what these companies are doing in terms of speech. Third structural source is complexity and opacity. And this, I think, is something, I think all of these you see every day. I'm just trying to give some theoretical basis so you can think about it. And the idea is that complex and opaque firms, they really hold an advantage over regulators and civil society for many reasons. No? The first is that it becomes really hard to understand what their real impact in society is, and it becomes even harder to mobilize stakeholders. If you don't know there is a problem, it's very hard to put a movement together to fight it. It becomes even harder to come up with policy solutions. Well, think about the questions about disinformation and fake news, a very complex problem. We know there is some issue there. It's very, very hard to come up with a solution that actually is going to do some good. You know? It's like, oh, there's a lot of trade-offs involved. And what comes with it is that as regulations become more complex, they become easier to capture. And the devil is always in the details. So if you're going to look at the Frank-Dodd Act that has like 1,000 pages, and you can manage, or even the DSA and the DMA, which are these huge pieces of regulation, a small tweak in an article can be the difference whether there is good enforcement or not. So the more complex the regulation, the easier it is for companies to shape the regulatory environment. And the fourth point, I think, which is also, I think, underappreciated, is that the more complex and the more opaque the market is or the company is, the smaller the pool of talent that there is to regulate this company. So yesterday I was having a fascinating chat over dinner about deep sea underwater mining, which is a very specific topic. And there are just not that many people who understand this well, you know. So if this is a market where like you have to study the market for 10 years to understand it well, it's much easier for companies who have much more resources connecting their structure of financial power to hire these people and starve regulators, starve civil society with the kind of talent pool that it would need to actually impress and influence the legislation. That's number 3. And that's why you see, why it's so important for calls now on the DSA to actually give access for researchers and academics and others on data. And that's why you see as well why companies punish so hardly whistleblowers, because they understand the power of opacity and complexity. And they understand that if there's some ways of, like, the best way to know what's going on is when someone from inside announces. And so a very good way to do is that you can punish whistleblowers, and this happens a lot. Fourth source of structural advantage is what we call connectivity or membership. And that is that companies and entities and also civil society activists and NGOs, sometimes they can hold a large customer or voter base and are able, in doing so, mobilizing these people on their support. So these powers become much stronger if these companies are employ or the economic source of this employment. I think we discussed this before. And I think it's always good to remember that politicians' biggest fear is voters. No? So if you can mobilize voters, that's a very effective strategy to have some kind of governance power, lobbying power. And you see these, for example, in big tech, you see this like right now, Amazon and Google are using these a lot. Small companies that somehow rely on them to shape regulation. Uber's main public policy strategy was actually to enter cities, build a group of drivers who relied on them, and then using the drivers to pressure municipalities. So that's a very, very important source of power as well, that's separated from complexity and opacity and media. And then finally, I think the final one, which I think is more self-explanatory, is the notion that there's a national champion. So some sectors at some point are elevated to some strategic importance designation, and this allows them to claim that anything that's harmful on the sector is going to be harmful on the country as a whole. And if you somehow can convey this message, this can be incredibly powerful. And so I don't think I need to tell anyone on the power of the German car companies, auto industry here, but that's an example. But also, when you look at big tech, which was the source of this report, the first time that Mark Zuckerberg was testifying in Congress, someone took a picture of his notes, and pretty much the note said, anytime people mention regulation, you just answer China. And this is is the argument. You know, it's the same argument. It's like, if you regulate us, you're going to be in power in China, so that's the source of it. So I think as you go thinking about sources of political advantage, it's interesting to look at the markets and the companies they are engaging, which of these powers they hold. No? Like, normally they're going to have some form of financial power. But not everyone has media or agenda setting power, actually. That's restricted to media companies and to companies who have some form of connection between politicians and users and others, also members. Not everyone has membership power. Not everyone can claim national champions. I think this varies. And what was interesting about big tech is that big tech actually is one of the few markets where you have all 5, probably the only market that we could think of, where you really have all 5 in a single market. So at some point, someone in a meeting was saying it's almost like if Boeing, the New York Times, and JP Morgan Chase and Walmart merge into a single company, and this would be more or less what you have. But this is what I had to share, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and if you believe that we forgot something, please come talk to me, because we are working on this more.
Thank you so much for those great there's a really nice pairing. It's the sort of experiential pairing and the nerd. Yes. And so I just wanted to call out a few things. I think just to underline some of the elements that I thought were really powerful in your presentation, Max, and to see if we can fit them into your structure. So one of the things that you talked about is the sort of early stage role, Max, of like total. And I guess it's an agenda-setting role, but like what is on the table and what is not on the table. And just to get a better sense from you of the mechanics of how that agenda-setting happens, if I'm trying to fit it with Filippo's model here. Is it, and I mean real mechanics, and I come here as interested in the sociology of the political dynamics here, right? So is it, cocktail party? Is it an event like this? Is it because in the United States, our model is very much a campaign finance model. So we have a triangle, basically. There's donors, lobbyists, and lawmakers. The donor gets a call, and the next day the lobbyist visits, if that makes sense. So, hi, will you please give me $2,700? That's the Congress member calling the lobbyist. And the next day, that same firm, or within the week, that same firm will come and not talk about money at all, but talk about their agenda and their goals and how it will support their workers. So there's a pretty transactional, whether you want to structure. And that's where a lot of the agenda setting happens, along with just the ratio, the sort of collective ratio of lobbyists and think tank in DC. So the social milieu, the friends are all, that's where a lot of the agenda setting, where that which is ridiculed, it's too funny, it won't be taken seriously, even before one presents the idea. It's a really important point you made. I'd just love to get your sense of how that is happening. Like what is the moment and mechanism of saying, unwinding is off the table, or if you talk about unwinding, I'm trying to spinning off, breaking up. What is the point at which the parliamentarian will say, I care a lot about this, but that's off the table. When will they come to understand what is outside the scope of discourse?
Do you want me to respond now? Okay, yeah, great, okay. Well, first of all, let me say I cannot talk so much about the US, of course.
No, so I'm curious
so
about
just about Europe and Germany, I have some experience, and yeah, I would say the role of donors is not that much happening here in Europe. There are other things happening at this early stage of lobbying. We have party donations, for instance, in Germany, yeah, but not these specific donors to candidates, right? I always say lobbying is very diverse, and you have different forms of influencing the process. But at the early stage, it's about an important role for think tanks. We saw that with the Digital Markets Act, and actually big tech firms here in Europe made use of that a lot. They asked think tanks to provide studies, to provide reports that showed the costs of regulation, that showed how it undermines actually consumer benefits. This kind of stuff is happening at this very early stage, and it sets the frame. Don't regulate too much. So that's how I imagine it to happen, and it's a playing together of law firms, of law and economic firms who provide also reports, and at the same time do advocacy actually, and provide other services like suing actually, or to Google, for instance, yeah, and think tanks which are sponsored. A lot of think tanks in Europe are sponsored by big tech. So this kind of framing?
No,
does that help?
It does, because it actually relates to Filippo, which this suggests, I'm fascinated with the sort of sources of power. You know, you go back to Hobbes, it's like, where's power? What are all the different ways that power can operate in a society? And so what Max is suggesting, I think, is that to add to your list, which is a traditional source of power, is just technical expertise, that information and sort of technical expertise. Now, would you put that in a subset of your obscurity frame? Or is it somehow different that the power of coming with a complete story about the way the world works and the technical backup is a separate source of power?
Yeah, I think that, so something I didn't get in the presentation, but I think it's important to separate sources from mechanisms. You know? So I think that there are things that are sources of power, and opacity and complexity is a source of power. But then there are ways in which this power is yielded, and these are the mechanisms to which it is yielded. And I think that basically, when you look, I think this is totally under theorized as well. In this article that I mentioned with Luigi and Eric, we're trying to think about the mechanisms. But there are two very important ones, which I think they are separate, and it's important to separate them. One source of mechanism, of regulatory capture can be lobbying and some kind of like revolving door, like this direct money contribution. So this is almost like a soft form of corruption, you know. Like it's a fine line. You can say that, like, oh, depends on the rules, depends on the impact, etc. But you're kind of convincing someone in a public position to do something that is against the public interest. And that's bad. It's hard to detect. It's like always bad, but we can discuss it. I think that a more insidious form of capture and much more present and much harder to tackle is what in that article we call epistemological capture. And epistemological capture is the moment where companies that have media power and that are in a very complex and also very complex and opaque shape the informational environment in a way that the people taking the decisions take decisions that benefit their special interests without realizing that that's against the public interest. And that's because they just have a very partial view of the world. And this is really dangerous because this doesn't require any bad faith act whatsoever. You know?
Right.
And this is something that, like, all my interaction, I worked a little bit with the Brazilian Antitrust Authority, with other people. When you talk to public servants, they're good people normally. They're competent. They're trying to do good things. You know, they're not there. They're getting a lower salary. They're not there because they want to sell out all the time. They're there because they believe in what they're doing. But sometimes they are in this environment. The markets they work with they're so complex, and they are in this environment that's so shaped by information that they end up taking bad decisions, because that's what they thought was the best thing to do. And then I think that understanding that this is a mechanism through which capture takes place that relies on opacity and complexity, and then relies on financial resources and media capacity, etc., is a way of starting separating the source from is a better way to target, to tackle this problem if you can separate them both. But maybe it's impossible to separate them. But that's just how I think.
No, that's really helpful. So I just to push you on that a little bit, because I've met you once before, so I'll be a little more aggressive. Max,
go for it.
After the third time, I'm no longer nice. No. No.
Lucky me.
No, but so, I mean, a traditional understanding, a theoretical understanding, is that information itself, it's a cliche, but that sort of the collection of information itself is, in fact, a source of power, not just a mechanism of power. And so, what I hear you saying is that resources are the source that give you the informational, as opposed to information being a separate foundational source of power. Is that?
Yeah, it could be. I feel that it depends where you add the complexity and opacity. Like if you're adding complexity as something that is harder to gather information, then I think we're very much aligned.
Got it.
If you're thinking the way that you yield the information itself, that's what I would call the mechanism. But it's not 100% straightforward separation. I'm willing to give that. But
okay. Yeah. So what I love about your presentation, I think is really important, is I come from the anti-corruption world, and many economists' intervention in anti-corruption are actually quite disappointing. And even when they attempt to be helpful, because they rely on that which is really easily measurable. I fell into this trap earlier where I talk about $70 million in funding. But the tendency then is to say, can you measure the impact on legislation and the correlation between campaign funding and impact on legislation. And John de Figueira, who we just saw recently, will tell you there's very little impact, because what you can measure is the correlation between lobbying on a bill and an impact, and that's not where you actually see the power happening. And what I really appreciate about the structure you're bringing is that is a resistance to the empirical model of power. And I think there's a really important ideological shift happening, that we do not have to, that it is legitimate to rely on narrative experience and theories of power as opposed to that which is measurable. So I guess then in that context, something you mentioned in, I think, 3 of your different 5 was fear. You know?
Yeah, I liked Filippo's notion of the loaded gun combined with the national champion. I really had to think of the German car industry, or of this sentence we heard yesterday, right, in a lobby meeting. If we go against the German industry, we are politically dead. And I think this really illustrates the situation, right? So
yeah. And what's powerful about fear is that it is partly rational.
Yeah.
But you don't know how rational it is. So it sort of blends rational and emotional and sort of physiological. Again, I really appreciated David bringing the human into this. It's like we're studying what happens to the human in relationship to power. And so, anyway, you started to, in some of your description, sort of fit fear in there. But you only put it in the media section. So I guess the appreciation is that as we confront the economists, not all economists, thank you, Christian, and many others, but the resistance to the claims that these are real political problems, a lot of them will come in empirical form. And fear in particular, the loaded gun, is the hardest to measure. As someone who's been involved in politics, if you think maybe the telecom will spend money against me, people are going to process that information really differently depending on their own particular background and fears, and they don't necessarily publicly express that fear. They find other rational justifications and don't admit the fear itself. So when you think about developing the theory of fear and power, what would you like to study? How else would you like to think about that?
Yeah, it's. I mean, we tend to study in academia. We tend to study what you can get data on, and that's the reason why this whole area is under terrorized. Actually, is because it's interesting to see how you had an empirical revolution in economics that didn't reach like that much of these dynamics of political economy, because it's just very hard to get data. And that's why I think it's so important to see these obligations like the DSA obligation that mandates the sharing of data, researchers, and et cetera, so we can take a look at this. I think what is interesting here is to start looking at so the way that we would do it, and I'm actually involved in a project that's an interesting project, where you have to start looking at moments when there are changes to see how people behave. So what we're trying to look at, still early on, is like, you get like Citizens United and a shock and campaign contributions in the US. And then you can try to see if just the threat of someone entering and lobbying against, in our case, the state Supreme Courts, changes the behavior of judges, because elected judges, because they realize that the fact that suddenly someone can go after them, this can become a problem, you know. But this is a project that has been going on for 3 years. I've been involved in the past 4 months, and I think there's 2 more years of data collection, because we just have to hand collect data on everything. So I think one of the problems is this area is exactly that we don't have the structures to study them in depth, and then it becomes, and that's why it's so important to talk to people. That's why I think you're asking the wrong person. You should be asking them to come talk to me and come talk to Christian and anyone else who is around. Is like, where do you see this manifesting so clearly that we could then come in and look in and say, oh, do we have the data? Do we have the capacity to study? So that's exactly why I'm here. And then, so please talk to me on breaks. Yeah, I would answer your question like this, escaping it.
Great, yeah.
No, just one additional point on fear, right? I think fear is not only of one's own industry, of the national champions. It's also, sometimes even a geopolitical question, right? If you confront big tech, you know this is not in the interests of parts, at least, of the US government, like the Department of Commerce. And there were, of course, reactions from that side, right? So it becomes a question of foreign policy sometimes. And this fear is, to a certain extent, of course, legitimate. You don't want to intervene into your relations with a friend country, right? So here's another challenge.
No, I think it's, and this is not a disagreement, but what you're suggesting is that moments of stasis are often moments where fear operates, which by definition make them incredibly hard to measure, because the fear is compounded by a fear of intervention, then which goes to the background story of what is intervening and what is not intervening, what is passive and what is not.
I think the problem with fear is to understand it well, is that you don't need to, if you have real power, you don't have to exercise it to change people's behavior. Yeah. It's like, if you understand that the only way to reach your constituents is through, I don't know, company X, or if you live in a company town, or is the US example, if you're fully dependent on that company for your education, etc., people are going to conform just because they conform naturally. And because of their interest, just the threat of exercise, it becomes a problem. So this is what makes it so insidious to study and makes it so powerful at the same time.
I completely agree. And Barry and I had an experience where Barry Lynn, who's going to speak later, was running an institute and came out in support of EU actions against Google, and got fired from the think tank. 8 people got fired. Very powerful moment. That's out in public. What's not in public is a friend of mine said, I know we've been doing these little videos together on antitrust, but my sister wants to get a foundation grant from Google, so can we stop doing these videos? That will never show up in any study. But these little micro moments of fear that then invade what is legitimate political discourse. The last thing I want to talk about and then open up is the rule of law. So, because this is also sort of in the background here of both of these discussions, but Max, you focused on it a little bit more, is what is the dynamic effect of unenforcement? Non-enforcement of law. What does that do to a democratic society?
Well, I think, first of all, as you might all imagine, enforcement is key. And the experience that enforcement doesn't happen is a problem not only for society, but also for the fact that corporations feel they don't have to fear anything, right? They don't just have to look at the resources for enforcement, and if that's not enough, like at the moment for the DMA, where we just envisage 80 full-time equivalents to work on the enforcement of the DMA. Then let's don't care, right? Let's don't care about the roots. But that's. I think the GDPR experience is one that's in a sense very traumatizing. We have a problem with enforcement in Europe. I heard from my US colleagues there's not such a big problem with enforcement in the US. There's more enforcement, at least in the antitrust field, happening. But I guess there are also other fields of policy where we have a lack of enforcement. But I guess a lack of enforcement is really, it's a fundamental problem for democracy, because if people no longer believe laws are enforced, they become frustrated with democracy, right? And corporations, they remain the winner in this case, and they don't have to care about, the rules themselves anymore.
The school at which I teach, I'm on leave this year, the school at which I teach has a portrait on the wall of one of our graduates. the head of compliance for Google. So myself and the other antitrust professor asked to take the picture down, but we're told he was one of our more prominent graduates. And it's this turning to you, if you want to speak to the rule of law, what's interesting to me, and I don't know how to fit this in your schema, is that his status, his social status is extremely high, sort of maintains, even despite basically, mechanism for law breaking, certainly in Europe. This is what we were talking about, is the lack of compliance in Europe in particular. So I don't, two last questions, then we can open it up, is both, how would you either fit rule of law questions into theorizing power and status that isn't just money or media?
Yeah, I want to talk something before what you mentioned, the role of enforcement. I think that's a problem. I'm a lawyer. I'm also an economist, but I'm mostly a lawyer now. And then I think that for a long time in law, we used to see changing the law as almost the final moment, And then we lost that. I've studied GDPR enforcement, which is a total mess. Yeah, it's a total mess. It doesn't work. But I think the GDPR was the moment where people realized that changing the law alone is not enough. Because if you want to enforce laws well, you need to think about enforcement before you pass the law, not afterwards. Because once there's a big status quo bias that once something is passed, it's very hard to change, because then everybody's is changing their behavior a little bit to accommodate to that. There's more interest. So I think that's the main problem under enforcement. The second main problem is that I think it's also important to recognize that under enforcement can be a political strategy. Because it's anyone who lives here understands how hard it is to sustain a social movement around a topic. You have to create dynamic, have to create this kind of group that gets together and cares about this and goes protest, or that sends I don't know how many postcards to DG Comp that they say they send to complain about the Bayer Monsanto merger. And this takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and this requires a lot of like work to keep it going. But then if a way to break this cycle is that if you can pass a law and you believe that you reach like a moment of like a change, but then there is no enforcement on the other side, you hollow this movement out. And this can be an effective strategy to demobilization as well. And I think it's important to recognize that enforcement is as key or more key than the law itself. I think it's more key. That's how I see the world. And so for people who are engaged in this, it's you should be even more engaged after something's passed than before. I mean, you have to engage before, because if you pass a bad law, it's hard to enforce. But just passing a law is not enough. I think that I would say on this. And then how you put on the framework, I'm not sure. So I won't.
Just one final point on enforcement. I think enforcement is not only a question of the lawmaking process, but also of those implementing, enforcing it. And this is also, of course, a question how public officials act, right? And I mean, I'm a deep believer in public service and its importance, but I think many public institutions are underfinanced. And this is also a legacy of neoliberalism, of 30 years of neoliberalism. And there we also have a gap to fill, right?